Hello, you're on Pablo Spot. I'm George. Welcome to a new series where I touch on different ways of managing AWS credentials used when standing up infrastructure from code. Today, I will be creating a terraform module that would leverage on AWS Security Token Service to manage short-lived AWS credentials. And so if this series and the content of this channel lines up with your interests, hit the subscribe button and join me in this journey of learning by doing. So, let's start coding. I have AWS CLI installed on my machine via ASDF. What most people would normally do to be able to run AWS CLI is to configure a profile like this. Once this is set, you can then start exporting AWS profile environment variable each time you open a new terminal session. And so if I open a new tab here, and then export my newly created AWS profile, I can then start running AWS CLI commands and get some results. The problem with this setup is I end up having to store AWS credentials that are long-lived for users that have elevated permissions. And so I run the risk of compromising my AWS account if these access key ID and secrets get exposed. One solution that addresses this involves leveraging on AWS Security Token Service. So let me exit this terminal. I'm going to create a terraform module for this. And so for a start, I'll create a new directory and then cd to this new directory, and then initialize Git. And then I will run my script to generate the Terraform template code on this directory. And then I'm going to launch VS Code from here. The first thing that I need to do is update my backend.tf to configure the workspace where I will store my save files. So on my backend.tf, I will set the organization as well as the workspace as component for my backend. And now I'll open my main.tf to start the main infrastructure code. The first resource that I need to create here is the role that will be assumed by the user. The IAM role resource needs to have a name property which I will source from a variable. And so I need to head to my variables.tf to define this new variable. And now back to my main.tf. I also need to set the assume role policy property. I need to set the source of this property to a data reference. So on my data.tf, I will allow STS assume role action for this policy, and then grant the trust on my AWS account by setting the principals block and point it to my AWS account root identifier. But before doing that, I need a data reference that points to the identity of the AWS account. And now I can use this data reference to pull the associated account ID. The next change is where I verify that the account that is trying to assume this role is legitimate. I will add a condition block to check that the external ID that is passed in the API call to AWS matches with what is expected. To set the value for this external ID, I will generate a random string that I will store in parameter store. And so on my main.tf, I'm going to create my SSM parameter resource. I will set the name property of this resource and get the value from a variable. And then I'll head to my variables.tf. I'm going to set a default value. And now back to my main.tf. I will update my parameter store resource and set the type property to secure string, and set the value property using a random string generated by a function called UUID. And back to my data.tf, I can now update the values property on my condition and fetch the value I stored on my parameter store resource. And then back to my main.tf, I can also update the assume role policy property to point to the data reference that I just finished setting up. I also need to add the manage policy ARNs property that will hold the permissions that I want the assumed role to have. I'm going to derive the value of this property from a variable. And so let me head to my variables.tf and define this. Now let me head back to my main.tf. The next resource I need to create is the actual Iam User. This resource needs a name property which I will get from a variable. So as usual, let me switch to my variables.tf to define this. Now back to my main.tf. I need to define a policy resource that I will attach to the IAM user. And then I'm going to set the name property for this resource using the username variable. And then I'm going to set the user property and point this to the IAM user resource that I've created previously. And then I need to set the policy property, which will define the policies that I need to attach to this particular user. I will set the value of this policy property to a data reference to a policy document. So let me head to my data.tf and define this. The first permission that I need to set for this user is to be able to assume the role that I created earlier. I also need this user to be able to access the external ID that is stored in a parameter store resource that I also created earlier. And lastly, I need this user to be able to decrypt the string that I stored in the parameter store, since I stored the external ID as a secure string. I have stored the external ID using the default KMS key for the systems manager, and I need my user to get access to this key to be able to decrypt the external ID value. So I will create a data reference to this KMS resource. And now I can plug this in inside the resource parameter of the final policy statement. To implement least privilege on this account, I will add a condition block on this final policy document to only allow decryption to the external ID key that's stored on my parameter store. And now, back to my main.tf. I can then update the policy property on my user policy and point it to the data reference that I've just set up. And that's it. That's my Terraform module. So let me head to my VS Code terminal and validate this. I got a validation error in here that's complaining about the property that I used for my data reference for my KMS resource. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'll head to my data.tf. And now back to my VS Code terminal and rerun my validation. And now the validation is clean. Let me switch back to my VS Code Explorer. And in order to try this out, I will create a Terragrant configuration file in the root of this repository. I will set the source of my Terraform block to the current directory and define the inputs block. I have a set of required inputs that I've defined for this module. So I'm going to start defining the first parameter, which is the role name. I also need to pass the IAM username. And lastly, I need to pass a set of AWS managed policies that I want attached to the role. So I will add the default administrator access policy in this list. And now I'm all set to create the IAM resources on this module. And so let me switch to my VS Code terminal. Because the IAM user that this module will create does not exist yet, I will use my admin AWS profile temporarily. I also need to export my default Terraform workspace and my Terraform workspace prefix environment variable. And now I will run my script that will create the new workspace in my Terraform Cloud account. And now I'm going to run Terragrant plan. The Terragrant plan looks good, so now I'm going to go ahead and run Terragrant apply. My Terragrant apply was successful, so now that my resources are created, I will generate access credentials for this new user and then set a new profile. And now that I have set up the new profile that points to the IAM user that's created in this Terraform module, I'm going to re-export my AWS profile environment variable and point it to this account. And now let me try running AWS CLI command with this account. That command failed, and this is because the new IAM user has very limited permissions, and it has not assumed the IAM role that I've also set up in this module. I have created a script that fetches the STS tokens and exports the appropriate AWS environment variables on your terminal session. I will add a link to this script in the description below for your reference. What I'm going to do is source this script on my terminal, but before I do that, I need to set an environment variable called IAM_role that will be assumed inside this script. And now I'm going to run the same AWS CLI command. This time I'm getting an output for the run. That works now because I have fetched temporary tokens and reset my AWS credentials on this session to use these tokens. Now, my script sets the effectivity of these tokens to be within 15 minutes. So let's wait for that time to expire, come back to this session and see what happens when I run the same command. So now 15 minutes has passed. Let me rerun the AWS CLI command and see what happens. I'm getting a new error message here saying that the token has already expired, which means I need to fetch a new set of tokens in order to run and integrate with AWS API. So in order to fetch a new set of tokens, I will first need to unset my AWS environment variables and then rerun the source command. And now if I rerun the same AWS CLI command, I get a result, and that works again. And that's all I have for today. Stay tuned as I find other better ways to manage AWS credentials as I continue to work with infrastructure as code. In the meantime, please let me know what you think in the comments below and send me some likes if you find this useful. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like the content on this channel. Until next time, keep learning and stay safe.